Imagine you wake up one morning and everything you believed about who you are, who rules you, and what you owe the world has changed overnight. Not because of a slow evolution of ideas, not because of a philosophical debate in some distant university, but because of decisions made in smoky rooms, on blood-soaked fields, and in the quiet desperation of ordinary people pushed past their breaking point. That is the story of 1700s America, and it is a story that most people think they know, but almost nobody truly understands. Because before there was a United States, before there were founding fathers on pedestals, before there was a flag or a constitution or a national anthem, there were 13 separate, deeply different, often suspicious colonies clinging to the edge of an enormous continent they barely understood. They shared a coastline, they shared a king, and they shared, slowly and painfully, a creeping realization that something was about to break. To understand what broke, and what was born from that breaking, you need to go back, not just to 1776, much further. In the early 1700s, colonial America was not a single place. It was a patchwork of worlds. A tobacco planter in Virginia lived in a universe entirely different from a Puritan merchant in Boston, who lived nothing like a Quaker craftsman in Philadelphia. The forests beyond the settlements were vast, dark, and genuinely unknown, stretching thousands of miles into a continent that European maps still drew with guesswork and imagination. The average colonist never traveled more than 30 miles from the place they were born. The world was small, and yet, the forces gathering at its edges were enormous. Most colonists in 1700 thought of themselves as British, proudly British. They drank British tea, wore British cloth, argued about British politics, and prayed in British churches. The king was not an abstraction to them. He was the axis around which their legal and social universe turned. The colonial system was built on loyalty, on trade, on the understanding that England would protect them and they would enrich England. It was a relationship. And like all relationships, it worked beautifully. Until one side started taking the other for granted. That is where our story truly begins. The first thread in this tapestry was pulled not in a colonial city, but in the wilderness, in a place called the Ohio River Valley in the early 1750s. Here, two empires collided. Britain and France had been circling each other for decades, both hungry for the same prize, control of North America's interior. The French had built an arc of forts stretching from Canada down through the Great Lakes and into the Mississippi Basin. The British colonies were expanding westward, and the two expansion projects were on a direct collision course. In 1754, a young, ambitious, and frankly reckless Virginian militia officer named George Washington, 22 years old, largely untested, was sent into the Ohio Valley to confront French forces. What followed was a small skirmish that detonated into a global war. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, would eventually engulf 5 continents. Hundreds of thousands would die, and it would accomplish something that no philosopher or pamphleteer had yet managed. It forced the 13 colonies to think of themselves, for the first time, as something larger than individual provincial interests. Benjamin Franklin, in 1754, proposed the Albany Plan of Union, a radical document suggesting that the colonies coordinate their own defense. It failed. The colonies were not ready, but the idea had been spoken aloud. A seed had been planted in soil that was not yet fertile. What nobody realized at the time was that the war itself would water that seed, and the British government, in trying to pay for it, would add something far more potent than water. They would add fire. Here is something that history textbooks rarely emphasize with the weight it deserves. The British did not set out to oppress their colonies. They genuinely believed they were being reasonable. The 7 Years' War had nearly bankrupted the empire. Britain had fought that war partly to protect the colonies from French encroachment. In their minds, it was only fair that the colonies help pay for their own defense. So, in 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was, in the grand scheme of imperial taxation, not particularly severe. A tax on paper goods, legal documents, newspapers, playing cards. The revenues were to be used exclusively in the colonies. The British thought it was sensible, moderate even. What they had catastrophically miscalculated was the symbolic dimension of what they were doing. The colonists did not object primarily because the tax was financially ruinous. They objected because it was a tax imposed without their consent. No taxation without representation was not just a catchy phrase. It was a statement about identity, about rights, about the fundamental question of who gets to decide what you owe and to whom. For generations, the colonial assemblies had taxed themselves. They had managed their own internal affairs, and now, a parliament 3,000 miles away, in which no American sat, no American voted, was reaching into their wallets. The response was immediate and volcanic. Lawyers argued, newspapers raged, mobs tore down the homes of stamp collectors. In Boston, an organization called the Sons of Liberty emerged. Not quite a political party, not quite a street gang, something dangerous and new in between. The Stamp Act was repealed within a year, but the wound it opened did not close. Every subsequent attempt at taxation, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, tore it wider. The British government kept relearning the same lesson and kept refusing to believe it. The relationship was fracturing, and the fractures were becoming visible to everyone. But there was another story running parallel to this political one, quieter, slower, and in many ways more consequential for the long shape of American history. While merchants in Boston argued about taxation in the fields of Virginia and South Carolina, a different and darker system was solidifying into permanence. The institution of slavery had existed in the colonies since the 1600s, but in the early 1700s, it transformed in scale and in the explicit brutality of its legal architecture. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 consolidated decades of ad hoc legislation into a comprehensive system designed not just to control labor, but to define human beings as property, permanently, hereditarily, and with the full force of law. Children born to enslaved mothers were enslaved. There was no legal path to freedom except through the will of an owner. The line between black and white in Virginia law became, for the first time, an absolute and codified wall. The tragic irony that would haunt America for centuries was being constructed at the precise moment that its founding generation was developing its most eloquent language about liberty and the rights of man. The men who would write "all men are created equal" were, some of them, writing it in houses built by men and women who had been legally declared not to be men, in the relevant sense at all. This contradiction was not invisible to them. It was agonizing to some, rationalized by others, and willfully ignored by most. But it was there, embedded in the DNA of the nation before the nation even had a name. The story of America's birth cannot be told without it. By the late 1760s, the political atmosphere in the colonies had taken on a texture of permanent tension. Then came an event so sudden, so viscerally violent, that it changed everything about how ordinary colonists thought about British soldiers. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a crowd gathered in Boston around a small detachment of British redcoats. The details of what followed were, and remain, genuinely disputed. Rocks were thrown. Taunts were hurled. Someone, it is still unclear who, gave the order to fire. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. The event itself was, by the scale of history, relatively small, but what happened next demonstrated the extraordinary power of narrative in shaping political reality. A young Boston lawyer named John Adams, who believed deeply in the rule of law even when it was uncomfortable, defended the British soldiers in court and secured acquittals for most of them. He did it because he believed no man should be denied a fair trial, and history remembers him for it. But a propagandist named Paul Revere did something else. He produced an engraving of the event that showed a disciplined line of British soldiers deliberately firing into a helpless, peaceful crowd. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation, and it spread through the colonies like wildfire. The Boston Massacre entered colonial consciousness not as what it was, but as what the revolutionary movement needed it to be, proof that the British Crown was prepared to murder its own subjects. The power of the story had outrun the power of the facts. In politics, it almost always does. 3 years later, in December of 1773, the confrontation found its most theatrical expression. The Tea Act of 1773 was actually designed to help colonists. It lowered the price of tea by allowing the East India Company to sell directly to colonial retailers, bypassing middlemen. but it still maintained the principle of parliamentary taxation. And it threatened the livelihoods of colonial merchants who had built profitable smuggling operations. On the night of December 16th, a group of men, some dressed as Mohawk Indians, though the disguise fooled almost nobody, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the freezing water. The Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous uprising. It was a carefully organized act of political theater, planned by the Sons of Liberty, designed to be dramatic enough that it could not be ignored and symbolic enough that it could not be easily answered with half measures. The British answered with the coercive acts, called by colonists the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's harbor, revoking Massachusetts' self-governance, and requiring colonists to house British soldiers. It was meant to isolate Massachusetts and teach the colonies that defiance had consequences. Instead, it did the opposite. The other colonies, watching Massachusetts strangled, felt the cold touch of their own possible future. Committees of correspondence had already been linking colonial leaders in a quiet web of communication. Now that web activated, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774. Men who had never met, from wildly different colonies with wildly different interests, sat in the same room and began for the first time to speak in a single voice. The British had tried to make an example of one colony. They had accidentally created a nation. And then came the morning of April 19th, 1775, the specific morning when the talking stopped. British troops marching toward Concord to seize colonial weapons stores were met at Lexington by a small militia force. In the tense standoff that followed, a shot was fired. To this day, no one knows which side fired it. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call it the shot heard round the world. It was not dramatic in the moment, a brief skirmish, 8 colonists dead, but it was the crossing of a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Blood had been shed. The argument had become a war. What is remarkable, and what is so easy to lose sight of from a distance of 250 years, is how uncertain everything was in that moment. There was no inevitable American victory. There was no guarantee of unity. The Continental Army was a ragged, undersupplied collection of volunteers fighting the most professional military force on Earth. Fully a third of colonists remained loyal to the Crown. Another third were largely indifferent, waiting to see which way the wind blew. Only a minority, a passionate, organized, risk-taking minority, drove the revolution forward. They did it not because success was certain, but because the alternative, accepting a permanent relationship of subordination to a government that had demonstrated it, would tax them, control them, and if necessary shoot them, had become unacceptable. They chose the terrifying uncertainty of liberty over the suffocating certainty of submission. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted a document that Thomas Jefferson had drafted in 17 days, with contributions and edits from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. The Declaration of Independence was, in one sense, a legal argument, a case made to the world that the colonies had just cause for separation, but in a deeper sense, it was something else entirely. It was a statement of aspiration that reached far beyond its own moment. All men are created equal. 4 words. A claim so radical that the society making it did not yet live up to it and would spend the next 2.5 centuries, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, trying to close the distance between the promise and the reality. The nation born in 1776 was not a finished thing. It was a hypothesis, an experiment, a set of ideals placed inside a fragile political vessel and launched into a future that nobody could see clearly. The men who signed that document knew that if the revolution failed, they would hang for treason. They signed anyway, not because they were certain of victory, but because some ideas, once clearly spoken, cannot be unspoken. This is the story of how a civilization decides to become something new. It is not clean. It is not simple. It is not made of only heroes or only villains. It is made of contradictions, of courage and cowardice, of grand ideals and brutal hypocrisies, of ordinary people caught in extraordinary currents who had to choose over and over again who they wanted to be. The 1700s did not just produce a new country. They produced a new question, one that every generation of Americans, and in many ways the whole of the modern world, has been trying to answer ever since. What does it actually mean to be free? And what are you willing to risk to find out? I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era. The Declaration of Independence was signed. The words had been spoken. The idea had been launched into the world like a ship into a storm. Beautiful, radical, and terrifyingly fragile. But here is what the history books rarely linger on long enough. Winning the argument was the easy part. Now they had to win the war. And after the war, if they survived it, they had to do something that no collection of former colonies had ever successfully done in the modern world. They had to govern themselves. That is where this chapter begins. Not in triumph, in uncertainty. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years. 8 years of frozen winters, unpaid soldiers, smallpox outbreaks, and a continental army that sometimes held together through nothing more than the sheer stubbornness of one man. George Washington was not, by most military measures, a brilliant battlefield tactician. He lost more battles than he won. What he was, and what the revolution needed far more than tactical genius, was unbreakable. When his soldiers were starving at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777, eating bark and leather, when desertions were bleeding the army dry, when the Continental Congress couldn't fund a functioning military because it had no power to levy taxes, Washington held the line. Not because victory was visible, because giving up was unthinkable, and the world was watching. Not just passively. France, Britain's oldest rival, had been watching the Colonial Rebellion with enormous strategic interest. The French didn't fund the American Revolution because they believed in liberty. They funded it because they wanted to bleed Britain, realpolitik dressed in revolutionary clothing. But the effect was the same. French money, French ships, and eventually French troops tipped the balance. At Yorktown, Virginia, in October of 1781, the British general Cornwallis surrendered his army. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. But notice something. The revolution had only survived because of foreign intervention, because of financial support from a monarchy, the French crown, that would itself be swept away by revolution within a decade, partly inspired by the American example. History is full of these ironies. The tree of liberty was watered by the blood of kings who did not yet know they were next. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended the war and recognized American independence. The 13 colonies were now, legally, a nation, and almost immediately they discovered something alarming. They had no idea how to be one. The first attempt at a governing framework was called the Articles of Confederation. It was, in the most charitable interpretation, a document born of understandable fear. These were men who had just spent years fighting against a powerful central government. The last thing they wanted to create was another one. So, what they built was almost the opposite. A loose alliance of 13 essentially sovereign states, bound together by a Congress that had no power to tax, no power to enforce its own laws, and no executive to carry out decisions. It could ask the states for money. It could not compel them. It could pass laws. It could not make anyone obey them. Within a few years, the results were predictable and catastrophic. The national government couldn't pay its war debts. It couldn't regulate trade between states, which were already imposing tariffs on each other like hostile neighbors. It couldn't respond effectively when, in 1786, a Massachusetts farmer named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising of indebted veterans who were losing their farms to the same government they had bled for. Shays Rebellion was suppressed, but it sent a chill through the founding generation. If the government couldn't protect property, couldn't maintain order, couldn't pay its own soldiers, what exactly had they built? James Madison, a soft-spoken Virginian with one of the sharpest political minds in American history, had been warning about this for years. He had a name for the problem: the vices of the political system. And he had been quietly, obsessively, reading every book he could find on republics, ancient and modern, trying to understand why they failed and whether failure was inevitable. His conclusion was radical. The problem wasn't too much central government. The problem was too little. The Articles of Confederation weren't the solution to tyranny. They were the road to a different kind of collapse.